The Mississippi River is trying to move, and the only thing stopping it is a concrete structure in rural Louisiana that almost collapsed in 1973 and has never been the same since. It is called the Old River Control Structure. The Army Corps of Engineers finished building it in 1963, and its single job is to keep 70% of the Mississippi flowing down the channel it uses today, instead of letting it escape into a shorter, steeper route to the sea called the Atchafalaya. If the river ever wins that argument, Baton Rouge and New Orleans are left stranded on a saltwater estuary, cut off from the fresh water that supplies their people and their industry, and the stretch of river between them, which carries more than half of all American grain exports and holds a quarter of the country's petrochemical production, stops being a river at all. In April 1973, a flood dug holes under that structure deep enough to swallow a 5-story building on both sides at once, and engineers watched them grow toward each other. Why they were told the two holes must never meet, and what the river has been doing every single day since, is where this goes. But first, why a river would want to move at all. Rivers are not fixed. They look permanent on a map because a human lifetime is short, but a large river on a flat delta behaves less like a road and more like a hose lying on a lawn. The reason is sediment. A river carries an enormous load of silt and sand, and as it slows near the sea, it drops that load along its own bed. Over centuries, the channel builds itself higher. Its slope to the ocean gets gentler, and the water has to travel further to fall the same distance. Eventually, a shorter, steeper path becomes available, and water, given the choice, always takes the steeper one. When it switches, geologists call it an avulsion. The Mississippi has done this repeatedly. The Louisiana coastline is essentially a set of old deltas, each one built by the river during a period when it ran somewhere else, then abandoned when it jumped. Which brings us to the Atchafalaya. It branches off the Mississippi in central Louisiana and reaches the Gulf of Mexico by a far more direct route. And the difference between the two is not a subtlety. The bed of the Atchafalaya currently sits roughly 17 to 19 feet lower than the bed of the Mississippi at typical flow rates. That gap is the pull. Every year, the Mississippi raises its own bed a little more with sediment, and every year the Atchafalaya's shortcut becomes a little more attractive. By the middle of the 20th century, it was clear what was going to happen. The river was going to take the shortcut. Left alone, the Mississippi would have carved a new path to the Gulf during the 1970s. The consequence of that is what makes this an engineering emergency rather than a geography lesson. If the main flow of the Mississippi shifts west into the Atchafalaya, the old channel past Baton Rouge and New Orleans does not vanish. It becomes something worse than empty. Without the enormous outward push of river water, salt water from the Gulf pushes upstream. Both cities take their drinking water from that river. So do the refineries and chemical plants along it, which need vast volumes of fresh water to operate. The channel that made those cities exist becomes a saltwater arm of the sea. So in 1963, the Army Corps of Engineers finished the old river control structure in a side channel called Old River and gave it one instruction: hold the split. Keep roughly 70% of the water going down the Mississippi and let about 30% through to the Atchafalaya, the balance the river had at the time, and do not let that ratio drift. It is worth pausing on how strange that instruction is. Every other piece of flood infrastructure in the country is built to hold water back, move it, or store it. This one is built to stop a river from making a decision. It is not protecting a city from a flood. It is protecting the entire geography of southern Louisiana from being rearranged. Congress effectively ordered that the split the river happened to have in the middle of the 20th century would now be permanent, and handed the Corps the job of enforcing that against physics, forever, with no end date. For 10 years, it worked exactly as designed. Then came the spring of 1973. An unusually heavy snowpack had built up in the Rocky Mountains that winter, and it melted fast. What was happening underneath was worse, and nobody could see it. Water forced through the gates at the volume was spinning into violent eddies on the downstream side, and those eddies were digging into the riverbed like a drill. The engineering term is scour. One of the holes they later measured was roughly 300 feet across, and somewhere between 55 and 60 feet deep. That is a void the depth of a 5-story building, carved out of the ground directly beside and beneath a structure holding back the largest river in North America. And there was not one hole. There were holes on both sides of the structure, and they were expanding steadily toward each other. The assessment recorded from that emergency is the sentence that should be far better known than it is. If those two scour holes had met in 1973, they might have brought the structure down. Part of the foundation had already been scoured away. The left approach wing wall collapsed, and the response was as brutally simple as the situation allowed. The Corps brought in construction barges and dumped boulders into the holes, continuously for as long as it took, trying to fill a void they could not see with rock faster than the river could excavate it. Afterwards, engineers pumped grout underneath the structure to fill the space beneath its own foundation. They saved it. The river did not win in 1973. But here is the part that matters most, and it is not a dramatic flourish. It is in the engineering record. The low sill structure was permanently damaged. It can now handle only about 60% of the flow it was originally built to pass. The wall holding the Mississippi in place has been working at reduced capacity for more than 50 years. The Corps did not simply hope for the best after that. Additional structures were built alongside the original to share the load, so that the complex as a whole is no longer relying on the damaged low sill alone. That is the honest and reassuring half of the story. The system today is not the same fragile single point of failure it was in 1973, and it is monitored constantly by the Army Corps of Engineers. Nothing is failing right now, and no agency is forecasting failure. And what has not changed is the river's intention, and that is the uncomfortable half. The 17 to 19 foot advantage the Atchafalaya holds is not shrinking. Sediment keeps arriving. The Mississippi keeps building its own bed higher. Every year the case for the shortcut gets stronger, and every year the structure has to win the same argument again. The two highest floods ever recorded at Old River Control came in 2011 and 2019, both within the last 15 years. There's also a slower problem the structure creates by doing its job well, and it is worth being honest about. Holding the Mississippi in its current channel means the sediment it carries no longer spreads across the delta the way it did for thousands of years. That sediment is what built southern Louisiana in the first place. The land is literally made of it. Confined between levees, most of it now shoots straight out into deep water in the Gulf instead of settling on the marshes. So while the structure protects the cities, the coastline beneath and around them keeps sinking and eroding because it stopped being fed. Controlling the river is not free. The bill arrives as disappearing land, which raises the obvious question of what is actually being protected, and the numbers are difficult to overstate. The Mississippi River Ship Channel carries an annual trade impact of $226.5 billion. The port of South Louisiana, sitting on this stretch, is the second largest port in the Western Hemisphere and handles more than half of all United States grain exports. The Port of New Orleans ranked 7th in the country for total tonnage in 2023 at over 75 million short tons, and the Port of Greater Baton Rouge ranked 8th at just over 73 million. Between those two cities runs an 85-mile industrial corridor holding roughly 150 to 200 petrochemical plants and refineries, some of the largest refineries in the continental United States, accounting for about a quarter of the entire country's petrochemical production. It is a stretch that has carried serious and well-documented pollution and public health concerns for the communities living along it, and that is its own story. What matters here is that all of it was built on the assumption that the river stays where it is. Widen the frame further, and the Mississippi Basin produces 92% of American agricultural exports and 78% of the world's soybeans and feed grains. Roughly 655 million tons of American products move on the system every year, and it generates over $500 billion for the United States. For a sense of how tightly wound that is, an unplanned 12-hour closure of the ship channel can cost up to $3.8 million in lost output and $876,000 in wages. 12 hours. The 1973 near failure did not stay an engineering footnote either. The writer John McPhee visited Old River and published an account of it called Atchafalaya, and it is the reason anyone outside the Corps knows this place exists. He framed it as the clearest example of a wider American habit, the assumption that any natural process can be permanently overruled with enough concrete. Old River is the purest version of that bet, because the thing being overruled is not a single flood, but the river's long-term direction. And the bet has to be won continuously rather than once. None of this means the river is about to jump. Avulsions play out over decades and centuries, not seasons, and nobody can put a date on it. What it means is that the arrangement is not natural and is not permanent. It is maintained continuously by an institution that has to succeed every single time. And the flood record is not moving in a comforting direction. The two highest floods ever measured at Old River Control both happened within the last 15 years, which means the structure's hardest tests are not receding into history. They are clustered in recent memory. Each one is another occasion when the gates, the foundations, and the riverbed around them are asked to perform under conditions closer to the edge of what they were designed for. The 1973 flood was survived by dumping rock into a hole nobody could see. Every large flood since has been a rerun of the same question with better instrumentation. The Mississippi has changed course before, many times, and every one of those old channels is still visible from the air across southern Louisiana. The only reason the current one is still the current one is a set of gates in a field in central Louisiana that came within two expanding holes of being swept away. Subscribe for the real numbers on the next one, verified and in full.